The wind in that canyon didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a raw, lonely sound that clawed its way across the Utah-Arizona border, a place where the earth was cracked and baked red under a sun that offered no mercy. This was Eliza Lee's world now. 30 years old, a widow for 5 of them, and tougher than the leather of her worn-out boots. She stood at the edge of her property, a small, stubborn patch of dust and rock she called home. Her cabin, built of pine logs and sheer grit, was the only sign of human life for miles. She had no neighbors, just the sky, the sage, and the silence. The air smelled of trouble. She could taste it, metallic and sharp, carried on that screaming wind. Eliza wasn't from this place. She was a preacher's daughter from Missouri, once soft-handed and full of gentle words. But this land, and the grief it held, had scraped her down to the bone. Her husband, Captain Jack Lee, had brought her here with a chest full of promises. He died in an ambush 3 winters ago, his life bleeding out into the red dirt. The Army sent a letter full of cold words and blamed it on renegade Navajo. Eliza never believed it. The official story felt too neat, too clean. She kept his blood-stained saddle hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin, a dark reminder that some questions never get an answer. That morning started like any other. Dawn, fire, chickens. She was checking her traps down in the dry wash when she heard it. It wasn't a coyote's howl or a bobcat's scream. It was a cry, a thin, terrified shred of a sound that the wind snatched and threw at her. It was the sound of a child. She dropped her basket and ran, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound led her to a cluster of sun-bleached boulders, and there, huddled in a crevice, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7, with long black hair matted with dirt and eyes wide with a terror she recognized from her own nightmares. 3 coyotes, lean and starving, were circling him. Their ribs showed through their dusty fur, their yellow eyes fixed on him with a chilling patience. This wasn't a hunt. It was a death watch. "Hey!" Eliza's voice cracked the silence like a whip. The coyotes turned, their lips peeling back from yellow teeth. They weren't afraid. They were desperate. Eliza didn't hesitate. She pulled the revolver from the holster on her hip, the cold weight of it familiar and comforting. The shot she fired wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the sky, a thunderclap that echoed off the canyon walls. 2 of the animals bolted, disappearing into the brush. But the third, the biggest one, just dropped low to the ground, its gaze locked on her. It was weighing its chances. Her, the boy, the hunger in its belly. "Get out of here," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. The coyote held her stare for another heartbeat, a silent challenge that hung in the superheated air. Then with a flick of its tail, it skulked away, melting back into the landscape. Silence descended once more, heavy and absolute. Eliza's hands were shaking as she lowered the pistol. The boy hadn't moved. He was panting, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. A nasty scrape on his shoulder was bleeding slowly, the dark red a stark contrast against his skin. He was clutching a small leather pouch to his chest like it was the only thing holding him together. She could see a piece of carved turquoise glinting from its flap. "You're safe now," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The boy just stared, not with fear, not anymore. It was something else, something harder, older, a weariness that didn't belong in the eyes of a child. Eliza took a slow step forward. He flinched. She immediately knelt, making herself smaller, less of a threat. "My name's Eliza," she said, keeping her voice even. "You understand English?" He said nothing. His lips barely moved, and a single whispered word escaped. A name. Tayo. Eliza froze. She'd heard that name before. Not the name itself, but the sound of it, the root of it. It was Navajo, and not just any name. It was a name tied to a specific bloodline, a name tied to power and to burden. "All right, Tayo," she murmured, her mind racing. "Let's get you cleaned up." He didn't fight when she lifted him. He was terrifyingly light, his body sagging against hers as if all his bones had dissolved. A fever was already burning on his brow. As she turned back toward her cabin, carrying the strange, silent boy, Eliza felt a cold certainty settle in her gut. Trouble hadn't just come to her canyon. She was holding it in her arms. She laid Tayo on her cot, the old wood frame groaning under the slight weight. As dusk bled across the canyon, painting the cabin's interior in shades of orange and purple, she tended to his wounds. The gash on his shoulder was deeper than she first thought, angry and inflamed. She cleaned it with whiskey and a clean rag, the boy hissing through his teeth but never crying out. He just watched her, his dark eyes following her every move. The fever was getting worse, his skin hot to the touch. While he drifted in a restless, fevered sleep, her eyes kept returning to the small leather pouch he dropped beside the cot. Her curiosity finally won. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. The leather was old and worn soft as butter, but the stitching was intricate. The turquoise clasp was carved in the shape of a bear, its form simple but powerful. She opened the flap. Inside there was nothing. No money, no trinkets, just a single folded piece of dried, flattened hide. It wasn't paper, but it was covered in markings. They weren't letters she recognized, but symbols. Lines and circles, animal figures, and star patterns. It looked like a map, but a map to a place that didn't exist on any settler's chart. And in the center of it all, one symbol was repeated over and over. A bear, the same bear that was carved on the clasp. This wasn't just a family relic. This was a document, a claim, a title deed to something ancient and powerful. This boy wasn't just a chief's grandson. He was an heir to something far more important. Something people would kill for. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Who were the men who had left him for dead? And what did they want with this strange map? She tucked the hide back into the pouch and held the cool turquoise bear in her palm. The stone felt warm, almost alive. For a moment, she let herself imagine a different life, one where her own child had lived, where she might have held a small hand just like this. The grief, always simmering just below the surface, threatened to boil over. She pushed it back down. This wasn't about her. She stirred the rabbit stew she had simmering over the fire and brought a bowl to the boy. He was awake, his eyes glassy with fever. Tayo, she said gently, you need to eat. You need your strength. He stared at the bowl, then his eyes flickered to the revolver hanging on her belt. Fear, plain and simple. Food, she said, pointing to the stew. Good. Eat. He didn't move. She sighed and sat on the floor beside the cot, placing the bowl on a small crate. She didn't push. She just waited. The silence in the cabin stretched thin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the boy's ragged breathing. Minutes turned into an hour. The stew grew cold. Finally, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. He jerked but didn't pull away. I'll stay right here, she whispered. I won't let anything happen to you. With hands that shook, he reached for the spoon. He dipped it into the cold stew and brought it to his lips. He ate slowly, mechanically, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a victory, however small, a tiny seed of trust planted in the barren ground of his terror. When the bowl was empty, she helped him lie back down. She couldn't rest. She sat by the fire, the turquoise bear clutched in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was this boy? What did this map lead to? And who was hunting him? The wind howled outside and it sounded like it was whispering a warning. Sometime after midnight, she must have dozed off, because a small sound jolted her awake. Tayo was sitting up on the cot. The fever had broken. His eyes were clear. He was looking at the leather pouch she had placed on the table. He pointed a small, trembling finger at it. Bear, he whispered, his voice raspy. Then he said another word, a Navajo word she didn't recognize. Nalin. Eliza's blood ran cold. Nalin. Chief Nalin. One of the most powerful and respected leaders among the Navajo tribes. A man known for his wisdom, but also for his fierce protection of his people and their lands. This boy wasn't just related to him. This was his heir, the last of his direct bloodline. Tayo looked at her, his gaze filled with a desperate urgency. They come, he whispered, his English halting. Men, find me. She understood. His grandfather wouldn't just be looking for him. He would be sending warriors, and the men who had taken Tayo, they would be looking for him too. They hadn't left him for dead by accident. They must have lost him in the canyons. Now they were hunting him, Her small, isolated cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was the center of a storm, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Morning broke across the canyon, spilling pale light into the cabin. Tayo was still sleeping, a deep, healing sleep this time. The fever was gone, but the exhaustion remained etched onto his small face. Eliza watched him, a fierce, protective feeling rising in her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She had built a life of solitude to keep the world at bay, to nurse her own wounds in peace. But now this child had crashed into her life, bringing a world of danger with him. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she wouldn't let him face it alone. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The world was quiet, deceptively peaceful. She walked down to the wash, her eyes scanning the ground. The coyotes had been back in the night, their tracks littering the dusty earth, but they had effectively erased any sign of Tayo's trail leading to her cabin. For now they were hidden. But for how long? When she returned, Tayo was awake, sitting on the cot and holding the turquoise bear. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was no fear in his eyes. Just a quiet watchfulness. "Eliza," he said, his voice clearer now. He was testing her name, testing this fragile connection between them. She offered him a small smile. "I'm here," she promised. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, a bond forged in fear and violence, but a bond nonetheless. Over a breakfast of dried bread and jerky, she gently questioned him. "Where did the men take you from?" she asked. His hands trembled slightly as he held his cup. "Home," he whispered, "from the canyon of my people." He pointed to the bear stone. "They wanted this." "The stone?" "And the map," he added, his eyes wide. "It is the way to the heart of the mountain." The heart of the mountain. Eliza had heard whispers of it from traders and prospectors. A legend, a mythical place deep in Navajo territory where the tribe was said to keep its most sacred relics, and according to some, a hidden vein of silver so rich it could make a man a king. Most dismissed it as a campfire story, but looking at the serious expression on this child's face, she started to wonder. She needed help. She needed information. She needed someone who understood the complex, shifting allegiances of this land. Someone who could walk the line between the white world and the Navajo world. There was only one person she could think of, a man she hadn't spoken to in years. "Tom Greaves," she said aloud. Tayo looked at her, his head tilted in question. "He can help," she said, more to convince herself than the boy. "He can tell us what this map means." Tayo nodded, his trust in her absolute. By midday, Eliza had her aging mare, Ember, saddled and ready. She was taking a huge risk. Riding to the trading post with a Navajo child was like lighting a signal fire. But staying here, isolated and blind, was an even bigger gamble. Tayo walked beside her, the precious leather pouch now tucked securely inside his shirt. The journey was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. They reached the dusty collection of tents and shacks that made up the trading post by late afternoon. As Eliza tethered Ember to a hitching post, a figure straightened up from his seat on the boardwalk. Deputy Eli Vane. He was a tall, lean man who moved with the lazy grace of a rattlesnake. His eyes, the color of chipped flint, missed nothing. He had been a thorn in Eliza's side since she'd arrived, always sniffing around, asking questions she didn't want to answer. He held a special kind of contempt for her, the widow of a decorated captain who chose to live like a hermit instead of returning to civilization. "Afternoon, Mrs. Lee," he said, his voice a low drawl. He didn't smile. He never smiled. "Deputy," she replied, her voice steady. His gaze drifted from her to the small boy standing half-hidden behind her. He took in Tayo's dark hair, his worn clothes, the unmistakable features. Vane's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Found yourself a stray," he commented, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. "He was hurt," Eliza said, guiding Tayo toward the entrance of the general store. "I'm looking for Tom Greaves." A flicker of something, interest, suspicion, crossed Vane's face. "Greaves," he drawled. "What's a respectable woman like you want with that drunken old relic?" But he didn't try to stop them. Instead, he casually leaned back in his chair, tipping it against the wall of the store. He was watching, and he was listening. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, dust, and cured leather. Tom Greaves sat at a small table near the back, a mug of coffee cradled in his gnarled hands. He was older than Eliza remembered, his face a roadmap of hard living, one of his eyes clouded over with a milky white film. He looked up as they approached, and a flash of recognition lit his one good eye. "Eliza," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "It's been a long time. And who's this little fella?" Eliza pulled up a chair. "Tom, I need your help. This is Tayo." She watched as Tom's gaze fell on the turquoise bear peeking out from the top of Tayo's shirt. He put down his coffee, his hands suddenly trembling. "Let me see that," he whispered. Tayo looked at Eliza, who gave him a reassuring nod. The boy pulled out the pouch and handed it to the old scout. Tom opened it, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the map drawn on the piece of hide. "By all that's holy," he breathed, tracing the symbols with a shaky finger. "This is it. The Sunstone chart. I thought it was just a story." "What is it?" Eliza pressed. "It's not a map to silver, Eliza," Tom said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a map to a meeting place, a hidden sanctuary where the leaders of the 5 tribes gather in secret. This chart, it's proof of lineage. Only the true heir of Nalin can possess it." Suddenly, the door creaked open. Eli Vane stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He wasn't even pretending not to listen anymore. "Well, well," Vane said, stepping inside, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. "Looks like you found more than just a stray, Mrs. Lee. You found yourself a little prince." Eliza's blood went cold. This was bad. Very bad. "He's just a lost boy, Deputy," she said, trying to keep her voice level. Vane let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't play dumb with me. I know who he is. There's a bounty on any Navajo found off reservation. A hefty one. But a boy like this, the grandson of Chief Nalin, the army would pay a fortune for that kind of leverage." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Tayo with a predatory gleam. "Hand him over, Mrs. Lee. This is official business. Don't make it difficult." Eliza stood up, moving herself between Vane and the boy. "He's under my protection." Vane's eyes hardened. "That's a mistake. A big one. You're harboring a fugitive. That's a federal crime." "He's a child," she shot back, her voice rising. "He's a pawn," Vane corrected her, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I'm about to cash him in. But I'm a reasonable man. There's a reward. I'd be willing to split it with you. For your trouble." The offer hung in the air, greasy and foul. Tom Greaves slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. "You've got it all wrong, Vane," the old scout said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You think you're holding a winning card, but you're not." Vane turned to him with a sneer. "And what do you know, old man?" Tom picked up the Sunstone chart from the table. "I know what this is, and I know it's not just a map. It's a treaty, an agreement between Nalin's people and—" He paused, looking directly at Eliza. "The United States Army, an agreement signed by one Captain Jack Lee." Eliza felt the floor drop out from under her. "Jack? Her Jack? What are you talking about?" she whispered. "Your husband wasn't just a soldier, Eliza," Tom said, his voice thick with old memories. "He was a man of peace. He was trying to broker a permanent truce with Nalin, one based on shared territory, not reservations. This chart was part of it, a gift, a promise. It designates the heart of the mountain as sovereign Navajo land, protected by Army treaty." He turned his gaze on Vane, his good eye burning with contempt. "A treaty that some people inside the Army didn't want to see signed. People who stood to profit from a war, people who might arrange an accident for a captain who was getting in their way." The implication was horrifying. The ambush, the renegade Navajo, it was all a lie, a cover-up. Vane's face went pale. "You're insane. That's a wild accusation." "Is it?" Tom challenged. "Or is it the reason you've been so interested in Eliza all these years? Were you afraid she might have a copy of the treaty? Afraid she might find out the truth about how her husband really died? Vane's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip. It doesn't matter, he snarled. That treaty was never ratified. Captain Lee died before he could file it. Without his signature, this map is just a piece of leather. And that, boy, is just a bounty. He lunged for Tayo, but Eliza was faster. She shoved the table into his path, sending mugs and bags of flour crashing to the floor. Run! She screamed at Tayo. The boy didn't hesitate. He scrambled out the back door of the store as Tom Graves swung a heavy sack of beans at Vane's head. The deputy ducked, cursing, and drew his pistol. You've just signed your own death warrant, Eliza, he roared. Eliza grabbed an iron skillet from a hook on the wall and threw it with all her might. It clanged off Vane's shoulder, making him stagger. It was the only opening she needed. She bolted after Tayo, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They were no longer just hiding a lost boy. They were protecting the legacy of a good man and running from a killer who would stop at nothing to bury the truth forever. And the only proof they had was a map on a piece of hide held in the hands of a child. The sun was bleeding into the horizon as Eliza and Tayo scrambled through the scrub brush behind the trading post. The shouts from inside the store were fading, replaced by the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She grabbed Tayo's hand, pulling him along. This way! To the horses! Tom Greaves caught up to them near the hitching posts, breathing heavily, a rifle now gripped in his hand. Vane won't be down for long, he panted. We need to move, now. Where do we go? Eliza asked, her mind reeling from the revelations. Her husband, a peacemaker. His death, a murder. It was too much to process. There's only one place, Tom said, his face grim. We have to get this boy and that chart to Chief Nolan. It's the only way to protect him and the only way to expose what they did to Jack. Eliza swung herself onto Ember's back and pulled Tayo up in front of her. Tom mounted his own scruffy-looking horse. Vane will have a posse within the hour, he said, looking back toward the town. He'll tell them we kidnapped the boy. He'll twist the story. He'll be hunting us, Eliza said, a cold dread washing over her. Not just us, Tom corrected. He'll be hunting that chart. It's the last piece of evidence that could ruin him and the men he works for. We're not just running for our lives, Eliza. We're running to clear your husband's name. They spurred their horses, leaving the trading post and its single dusty street behind them. They didn't take the main trail. Tom led them south into the labyrinthine canyons that snaked through Combe Ridge. It was rough country, a place where trails disappeared, and the landscape itself seemed designed to confuse and mislead. Vane thinks like a soldier, Tom explained as they rode. He'll expect us to take the fastest route. He won't expect us to go deeper into Navajo territory. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the clatter of hooves on rock. Tayo was a small, warm weight in front of her, his body tense. He held the leather pouch containing the sunstone chart tight against his chest. As darkness fell, they found a small, sheltered alcove to make camp. They didn't risk a fire. They ate cold jerky and drank sparingly from their canteens. Tom, Eliza began, her voice barely a whisper in the vast, dark silence. Did you know about Jack? All this time? Tom sighed, the sound heavy with regret. I was in Jack's command. I was there, Eliza. Not at the ambush itself. I was on a scouting mission. But I saw the aftermath. The tracks were all wrong. The arrows were commercial, not hand-fletched. It was staged, sloppy but good enough to fool the investigators who wanted to be fooled. Why didn't you say anything? Her voice was tight with accusation and pain. Who was I going to tell? He asked, his voice raw. Vane was Jack's cousin. Did you know that? He was the one who took over the investigation. He declared it a renegade attack within hours. Anyone who questioned it was reassigned or silenced. I was an old scout with a drinking problem. My word against a decorated deputy's? I would have ended up dead in a ditch. Jack's cousin. The revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. The contempt in Vane's eyes, the constant harassment. It wasn't just about her being a widow. It was personal. It was a deep, twisted family resentment. He was always jealous of Jack, Tom continued, staring out into the darkness. Jealous of his rank, his reputation, and I think he was terrified that Jack's treaty with Nalin would actually work. A lot of men were getting rich off government contracts to supply the forts. Peace is bad for business. Tayo, who had been listening silently, spoke up. He is a man with no spirit, he said, his small voice clear and certain. The bear stone does not like him. Eliza looked at the boy, at his solemn, knowing face. This child had seen more ugliness in the past few days than most people see in a lifetime. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder. We'll keep you safe, she promised. By the second night, they were deep in the wilderness. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, a sea of red rock and twisted juniper trees. Tom was pushing them hard, his knowledge of the hidden trails their only advantage. During a brief rest, Tayo stopped and pointed to a small cactus, its thorns protecting a single, vibrant yellow blossom. He whispered a word in Navajo. What did he say? Eliza asked Tom. He's naming the flower, Tom explained. To his people, this land isn't just dirt and rock. Every plant, every stone has a name, a story. He's not just traveling through his home, he's reading it. As Tayo spoke, he gently touched the turquoise bear hanging around his neck. The bear is my mother's spirit, he said suddenly, looking at Eliza. She carved it for me the day I was born. She said it would always guide me home. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother. Where is she now? Eliza asked softly. Tayo's face clouded over. The men who took me, they took her too. Eliza and Tom exchanged a horrified look. This changed everything. They weren't just rescuing a boy. They were rescuing a family. They said she was insurance, Tayo whispered, tears welling in his eyes. They said if my grandfather did not meet their demands, she would disappear. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They were using a mother's life to blackmail a chief. What were their demands? Tom asked, his voice dangerously low. They want the heart of the mountain, Tayo said. They want the silver. So the legend was true, and Vane wasn't just after a bounty. He was after a treasure that could make him one of the most powerful men in the territory. He was using renegade Navajo, hired guns to do his dirty work, all while wearing a deputy's badge. Later that night, as Eliza lay awake, listening to the lonely cry of a distant coyote, she felt a shift inside her. The grief for Jack was still there, a hot, aching coal in her chest. But now it was joined by something else, a cold, hard fury. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about fighting back. She thought of the blood-stained saddle under her floorboards. For 5 years, it had been a symbol of her loss. Now it was a symbol of her purpose. Vane hadn't just murdered her husband. He had tried to erase him, to twist his legacy into something ugly. He had underestimated Jack, and he had definitely underestimated his widow. The third day dawned hot and unforgiving. The sun climbed the pale sky like a brass shield, beating down on the rocks until the air shimmered with heat. Tom Graves was starting to show his age, his movements slower, his face etched with fatigue. But his eyes were still sharp, constantly scanning the horizon. We're getting close to the San Juan Bend, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty sleeve. Nolan's winter camp should be another day's ride from there. But this is the most dangerous part. The land opens up. Less cover. As if on cue, he stopped, raising a hand for silence. He pointed to the southeast. At first, Eliza saw nothing but the vast, empty expanse of the desert floor. Then she saw it. A faint smudge against the horizon, a plume of dust. Riders, Tom said grimly. He pulled a battered spyglass from his saddlebag and raised it to his good eye. He was silent for a long moment. 5 of them, riding hard. One of them is wearing a cavalry jacket. Vane, Eliza breathed. Or his men, Tom grunted. He wouldn't come himself, not into this territory, but he's got army contractors on his payroll, mercenaries who don't care what side of the law they're on, as long as the money's good. They had to move, and they had to move fast, but the open terrain was a death trap. There's another way, Tom said, his voice hesitant. An old passage. The Navajo call it the Bone Trail. It cuts through the mesas. It's hidden, but it's treacherous. One slip, and you and your horse are gone. We don't have a choice, Eliza said, her jaw set. The entrance to the Bone Trail was nothing more than a crack in the face of a sandstone cliff. So narrow they had to lead the horses single file. The path was a crumbling ledge, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side. The wind howled through the narrow passage, trying to tear them from the rock. Eliza walked ahead, leading Ember, her boots dislodging small pebbles that seemed to fall for an eternity before disappearing into the abyss below. Tayo walked between her and Tom, his small hand gripping the strap of her saddlebag, his face pale but determined. Hours crawled by. Every step was a calculated risk. Finally, the narrow chute opened into a small, hidden hollow, a secret oasis with a trickle of fresh water and a few gnarled cottonwood trees. They were exhausted, their nerves frayed. They collapsed by the stream, letting the horses drink their fill. Tayo knelt by the water, and without a word, he took off the leather pouch. He opened it and carefully laid the sunstone chart on a flat rock. He touched the bear symbol with his finger and began to murmur in a low, quiet voice. It wasn't a plea. It sounded like a report. He was speaking to his ancestors, telling them what had happened. That chart, Tom said, watching the boy, it's his connection, his right to lead. To the Navajo, a man's word is his bond. But that chart, that's the word of the spirits written on the skin of the earth. If he gets that to Nalan, the old chief won't just welcome him home, he'll listen to him. That boy could unite the tribes. And that's what Vane is afraid of, Eliza realized. A united Navajo nation, with a legal claim to their land, backed by an army treaty. It would ruin his plans. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the hollow, the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet ricocheted off the rock face just inches from Eliza's head, showering her with stone splinters. They had been followed. "Ambush!" Tom yelled, diving for cover behind a boulder and bringing his own rifle up. Two men appeared on the ridge above them, rifles raised. They weren't wearing uniforms. They were hard-faced men with the dead eyes of hired guns. Eliza grabbed Tayo, pulling him down behind the inadequate cover of a fallen log. She drew her revolver, her hands steady, her mind icily clear. Another shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Tom's position. He returned fire, his shot echoing like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. One of the men on the ridge cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. "They're trying to pin us down!" Tom shouted over the gunfire. "They want the boy!" Eliza knew he was right. They weren't trying to kill them, not yet. They were trapping them. She risked a glance over the log. The second man was reloading, but he wasn't alone anymore. A third figure was moving along the ridge, trying to get a better angle. And it was Eli Vane. He hadn't sent his men. He had come himself. He couldn't trust anyone else with a prize this big. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim not at her, not at Tom, but at Tayo. Time seemed to slow down. Eliza saw the cold focus in Vane's eyes, the slight tightening of his finger on the trigger. There was no time to think. She acted. She stood up. "Hey, Vane!" she screamed, making herself a target. His head snapped toward her, surprise and fury warring on his face. It was the distraction she needed. In that split second, Tom fired again. His bullet slammed into the rock near Vane's feet, making him stumble. But it was Vane's other man who fired next. His bullet hit Tom in the side. The old scout grunted in pain and slumped down behind the boulder, his rifle clattering on the rocks. "Tom!" Eliza cried out. Now they were pinned. Tom was hit, and she was armed with only a revolver against two rifles. Vane's wounded man was back up, and they were caught in a crossfire. The situation was hopeless. Tayo looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. Then he looked at the sunstone chart, still lying on the rock by the stream. He crawled toward it, his small body low to the ground. "Tayo, no!" Eliza hissed, but he ignored her. He reached the rock and snatched the chart. As he turned to crawl back, a bullet from Vane's rifle struck the rock where his head had been a second before. He was trapped. Vane's cruel laugh echoed through the hollow. "It's over, Eliza. Give me the boy and the map, and I might let you live to bury the old man." Eliza gritted her teeth, her mind racing, searching for a way out where there was none. And then she heard it, a low rumbling sound, coming from the canyon path they had just taken. It was getting louder. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. Vane and his man heard it too. They looked at each other in confusion. Vane shouted down, "Did you bring the whole posse?" "It ain't us," his man yelled back, his voice edged with panic. A moment later they appeared, a war party. 10, maybe 15 Navajo riders, their faces painted, rifles held at the ready. They poured into the hollow from both ends of the bone trail, trapping Vane and his men on the ridge. They were led by a tall, imposing figure with silver-streaked hair and an aura of absolute authority. Chief Nalin had found them. Vane stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His perfect trap had just snapped shut on him. "You!" he screamed down at Eliza, his voice cracking with rage. "You led them here!" But it wasn't Eliza. Nalin's eyes weren't on her. They were on the small boy huddled by the rock. Tayo stood up, holding the sunstone chart high above his head. He shouted a single word in his native tongue, a word of greeting, of return, of victory. The warriors let out a powerful cry that shook the very stones around them. Vane and his man, realizing they were hopelessly outnumbered, threw down their rifles. The hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The silence that followed was more intense than the gunfire. The Navajo warriors dismounted, their movements fluid and precise. They surrounded Vane and his wounded man, their faces impassive, their eyes hard as obsidian. There was no escape. Chief Nalin walked forward, his presence commanding the small hollow. He didn't look at Vane. His gaze was fixed on the small boy who was now walking toward him, the sunstone chart held out in his hands. Nalin knelt, and for the first time, Eliza saw the stern chief's face soften. He pulled Tayo into a fierce embrace, burying his face in the boy's dark hair. It was a reunion of not just a grandfather and grandson, but of a leader and his future. "My son," Nalin said, his voice thick with emotion, speaking in English for Eliza's benefit. "You have come home." He then looked up, his eyes finding Eliza. They were dark, ancient eyes that seemed to see right through her. "You are the woman they call Sage Woman," he said. It wasn't a question. "The wind carried your name to us." Before Eliza could respond, two of the warriors were helping Tom, gently examining his wound. Another brought a water skin to her. There was no hostility, only a quiet, solemn respect. Finally, Nalin rose and turned his attention to Eli Vane. "You," Nalin said, his voice low and cold as a winter river. "You have the face of a coyote and the spirit of a snake." Vane, stripped of his rifle and his authority, tried to bluster. "I'm a deputy of the law. You can't do this. The army will." "The army," Nalin interrupted, his voice cutting through Vane's tirade. He took the sunstone chart from Tayo and held it up. "This is a treaty with the army. A treaty signed by a man of honor, Captain Jack Lee. A treaty you and your masters tried to bury with his body." Vane's face went slack with shock. He had believed the treaty was a dead end, a forgotten piece of paper. He never imagined it would surface like this. "And you have done more than break our laws," Nalin continued, his voice resonating with cold fury. "You have stolen our future." He gestured to Tayo. "And you have stolen his mother." At the mention of his mother, Tayo flinched. Nalin put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Where is she?" Nalin demanded, taking a step toward Vane. Vane's arrogance crumbled, replaced by a desperate, cornered fear. I don't know what you're talking about." Nalin's gaze was unwavering. "You lie. My scouts have followed your trail for days. We know you work with the Red Hand warriors, outcasts from our own people who have sold their souls for whiskey and silver. They hold the boy's mother. Tell me where." Vane swallowed hard, his eyes darting around at the grim-faced warriors surrounding him. He saw no mercy there. His only chance was to bargain. "Let me go," he croaked. "Let me go, and I'll tell you." Nalin simply stared at him, his silence more threatening than any shout. The deputy began to sweat. All right," he stammered. "They have a camp, in the Skeleton Mesa, an old cliff dwelling. That's where they're holding her." Nalin nodded slowly, as if Vane had just confirmed what he already knew. He turned to one of his warriors and gave a quiet order in their native tongue. The warrior nodded and walked over to Vane's wounded man, who was slumped against a rock, pale from blood loss. The warrior knelt and began to tend to his wound. Vane stared in disbelief. They were helping his man. "We are not savages, deputy," Nalin said, seeing his confusion. "We do not leave a wounded man to die in the desert. We will see that he gets back to the fort. He will carry a message for us. He will tell your colonel what you have done. He will tell them that the Navajo have the Sunstone Chart, and we will honor the treaty Captain Lee proposed, and we will expect them to do the same." He then turned back to Vane, and his face was granite. "But you will not be going back?" "What are you going to do to me?" Vane whispered, terror finally breaking through his composure. "You have broken the laws of your people, and you have broken the laws of ours," Nalin said. "Your people can have what is left, but first you will face our justice." He looked at Vane with utter contempt. "You wanted the heart of the mountain, deputy. You will have it." Two warriors seized Vane by the arms, binding his hands behind his back. They dragged him away, his protest dissolving into panicked whimpers. Eliza watched him go, but she felt no triumph, only a profound weariness. She looked at Tom, who was now propped up against a saddle, his wound cleaned and bandaged with surprising skill by the Navajo healer. He gave her a weak but reassuring smile. Tayo came and stood beside her, slipping his small hand into hers. "Is it over?" he asked. "For him it is," she said softly, "but not for us. We still have to get your mother back." Nalin overheard her. "The Red Hand are traitors, but they are not fool," he said, walking back toward them. "They will know Vane has failed. They will be expecting us. Rescuing my daughter-in-law will not be easy." He looked at Eliza, his expression serious. "You have done more than enough, sage woman. You brought my grandson home. This is our fight now. You and the scout are free to go." Eliza looked from the proud chief to the small boy, whose hand was still gripping hers. She thought of the lonely cabin, the silent years, the grief that had been her only companion. She looked at Tom, who had nearly died for her, and she thought of Jack and the peace he had died trying to achieve. Going back wasn't an option. There was nothing for her there anymore. "With all due respect, Chief," Eliza said, her voice clear and strong, "you're going to need all the help you can get. Tom is the best scout in this territory, and she paused, her hand instinctively going to the revolver on her hip, "am a very good shot." Nalin studied her for a long moment. A slow smile spread across his face. "It seems," he said, "that my grandson was right to trust you. The spirits have sent us a true warrior." He turned to his men. "We ride for Skeleton Mesa at dawn." The stars were brilliant in the black desert sky, cold and sharp and impossibly distant. Eliza sat by a small, smokeless fire, the heat a welcome comfort against the night's chill. The Navajo camp was quiet, a collection of shadows and whispers. The warriors were resting, preparing for the fight to come. Tom was sleeping fitfully nearby, the healer having given him a strong herbal tea for the pain. Tayo was curled up beside her, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his head resting on her lap. He had not let go of her hand since Nalin had led Vane away. She gently brushed the hair from his forehead. He was just a boy, caught in a storm of greed and violence. But he had faced it with a courage that humbled her. He was the future of his people, a bridge between the old ways and the new world. She thought about Vane. She didn't know what kind of justice the Navajo would deliver, but she knew it would be absolute. The desert had its own laws, ancient and unforgiving. Vane had broken them, and the desert would claim him. Her own future felt just as uncertain. She had no home to return to, no path to follow. But as she looked down at the sleeping child, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in 5 years. Her grief for Jack was still there, a part of her soul, but it was no longer an anchor drowning her. It was a memory that gave her strength. She was no longer just a widow. She was no longer just a survivor. She was Sage Woman, and she had a family to fight for. At first light, they would ride into danger, to rescue a woman she had never met, for a people who were not her own. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the shadows, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Let me know in the comments below. What do you think the Navajo did to Eli Vane? Until next time, stay safe out there.